directly talk about the role race plays in our education system. Thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. We're really grateful for your attendance, for your excitement, for your engagement. Thank you for all of you who are joining us on Facebook Live. Make sure you like, share, comment there. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please make sure to use the Q&A tool. We want to hear your voices, your engagement, your excitement as a part of this webinar conversation. We have an amazing lineup, and we're going to get started very soon in around 2 minutes to make sure everybody can join in on the conversation. So go pop your popcorn, get ready, because we're going to have an amazing conversation about the role race plays in our education system, specifically on building the next generation of diverse teacher leaders. And to lead that conversation, we have Secretary of Education for Pennsylvania, Pedro Rivera, Dr. Travis Bristol, Assistant Professor at the University of Berkeley, Dr. Anthony Graham, Provost at Winston-Salem University, Gerard Robinson, Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation. We're going to have some special opening remarks from the Hunt Institute's new Director of K-12 Initiatives, Dr. Cuba Williams. And we're also going to have some remarks by Dr. Donna Marie Cole-Mallet from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So could not be more excited for all of you to engage with us and have this amazing conversation about the role race plays in our education system. So getting ready to start, and then I'm going to turn it over to our Dr. Keebler-Williams to make those opening remarks. But again, so grateful, so excited for all of you and for your love, your enthusiasm, and for sharing. Make sure you're in that Q&A tool, posting your questions, and make sure you're sharing the conversation on Facebook Live, and you're tweeting with our hashtag Race and Education webinar. Hashtag Race and Ed webinar is our hashtag for this conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Dr. Keebler-Williams.
Thank you, Senegal, and welcome to the third installment of the Hunt Institute's new webinar series, Race and Education. My name is Keebler-Williams, and I have a great opportunity to serve as the Director of K-12 for the Hunt Institute. The K-12 division is a new arm of the Institute's work focused on collaborating with school and district leaders on the development and implementation of effective and efficient practices and strategies to drive equity in schools. We are also currently working on 2 professional development series for school and district leaders, one focused on racial equity and one focused on leadership resiliency. If this is your first connection with the Hunt Institute, we were created by 4-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to support the education policy needs of governors, state lawmakers, and other senior level state officials. Today's conversation is about the importance of teacher diversity in America's education system. The pandemic has increased the need for teachers all across the country, but we know that Black and brown students have experienced serious inequities in the loss of life and the loss of instruction due to the pandemic. During our last webinar, 2019 National Teacher of the Year, Rodney Robinson, passionately discussed and communicated the importance of relationships and the need for more teachers of color. As students began to return to school this fall, and as many did this week in our home state of North Carolina, whether in person or hybrid, we will need teachers who understand their students' challenges and can give them what they deserve. I'd like to thank our panelists today, Gerard Robinson, Dr. Travis Bristol, and Dr. Anthony Graham, for your commitment and willingness to share your expertise and enthusiasm on bringing new teachers of color into the education pipeline. While the conversation today will focus primarily on the work being done to increase the number of male teachers of color, we recognize the incredible value of female teachers of color also. Today, we pause to honor female educators who are championing the success of students of color and refuse to stop until they have helped each student reach his or her greatest potential. We at the Hunt Institute are extremely excited for this conversation because we have been working on this issue of teacher training and recruitment by supporting the Developing and Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education, also known as DRIVE, task force created by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper. Dr. Graham does an excellent job of chairing the Drive Task Force, and we are happy to share that important work with all of you today. I'm also delighted to have Pedro Rivera, Pennsylvania Secretary of Education, as the moderator for this conversation. Pedro, we know you are incredibly busy trying to increase equity and access for Pennsylvania students, families, and educators. So we could not be more grateful you decided to share some of your time with us for this important conversation. I'll turn it over to you now, Pedro, for some welcoming remarks.
Looking forward to engaging in this opportunity in this space, because as we know, there has been no normal in the field of education and serving in our communities all across the Commonwealth. When we started off at the Department of Education and over the course of the past 5 years, we've been very focused on equity and providing equitable opportunities for students. And we really worked hard to lift, to break, to hopefully demolish the systemic barriers that exist that keep us from properly serving our students, our kids, especially in some of our most vulnerable communities. So being here today and being able to just celebrate, listen, and learn from colleagues all around, the U.S. is an opportunity I couldn't pass up. But I also wanted to take a moment to share. I mean, we've been highlighting and really championing the work, of diversity, championing the work of providing equitable resources and opportunities for all of our learners and communities. But COVID-19 has highlighted some of the inequities that exist, everything from funding to access to response and resources. And we found that we wanted to move from a space from just introducing policy, from just being champions in the world of education at the highest levels, and get a little more deeply engaged in the actual work. And as a practitioner, one of the areas that I'm most proud, to invite and introduce my colleague to share with you today is the work we've done through our Aspire to Educate, our A2E program. So I invited Dr. Donna Marie Cole Mallet to kind of present to you all for a few minutes today some of the most exciting work we're doing to diversify the teacher pipeline in Pennsylvania, but more importantly, the fact that we're not doing it alone. We're tapping our partners, we're tapping our community, and we're tapping our friends to make this work a reality. So if we could, for a few minutes, Donna, you mind sharing some of the great work you and the team are engaged in?
Thank you so much, Secretary Rivera. So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Donna Marie Cole-Malott, and I serve as Special Assistant to Deputy Secretary of Post-Secondary and Higher Education, Noe Ortega. And I wanted to take some time this afternoon to talk about our Aspire to Educate program and our own commitment at PDE to diversity and our teacher shortage and the implications for the next generation of teacher leaders in our state. So a little bit about A2E. A2E is a response to the teacher shortage in general, right? But it also focuses specifically on the shortage of teachers of color in Pennsylvania. And I'm not sure if you all are aware, but Pennsylvania is the least diverse state in the nation. So we fluctuate between 4 to 5% teachers of color. And we anticipate that COVID will impact that even more significantly because of the impact that it's having in diverse communities. I'm gonna close my window. And so A2E focuses on culturally responsive and sustaining education at the heart of A2E. We think about specifically how culturally relevant and sustaining educational practices are sort of at the heart of diversity, at the heart of retaining teachers of color. But culturally responsive and sustaining education is not just about people of color or students of color. It's about all students. It's about all teachers. We think about mentorship, recruitment, retention, PDs, and how all of those are key pieces to retaining teachers of color in our state. So we've partnered with 6 universities and the Center for Black Educator Development, but we also have partners who are not funded. We have partners who are committed to this work, partners who realize how important it is to diversify their program, but also to diversify the pool of teachers in our state as well. So some of those partners so far include Westchester University, Cabrini, Arcadia, Temple University, and Drexel University. So we've been working with them since the beginning of the year to develop toolkits around what we mean by mentorship, retention, equity. They're speaking from their own experiences. They're working collaboratively together to develop these toolkits. We've also developed competencies around culturally responsive and sustaining education that we want to be able to share as a resource to anyone who's interested. That will be institutions of higher education, K through 12 individuals, and we're beginning to pilot those this semester in many of the programs that folks are teaching in as well. So we're putting we're putting these things into practice because we can't wait, right? COVID is happening now. There's a lot of disparities in our communities of color, and we have to respond to, we were responding to it anyway, right? This is what this program was all about, but it has become a little bit more of an imperative at the moment because COVID has exposed a lot of those inequities. I mean, in the beginning of the year, what we found was communities that were predominantly well-resourced, communities that were predominantly white, right? They transitioned very easily into a virtual space. They had access to technology, they had access to resources that they need, and our communities of color continue to be impacted in ways where learning wasn't taking place in the time that it needed to take place. So I'm not gonna stay very long because I could talk about this forever, but we're thinking about putting all of this to practice. We're thinking about building with more partners across the state, building with stakeholders. We have been engaged. We're thinking about working with our K through 12 teachers on these competencies to see how they're impacting them now. And so we're working and we're building and we're expanding across the state because we know how important it is to diversify our teacher educator workforce. We have 33% students of color in Pennsylvania and only 4% teachers of color. So we see this as very, very important now and to keep this work going. So thank you so much, Secretary Rivera, and thank you all for having me today.
Thank you so much, Donna Marie, for sharing and for all the work you're doing on behalf of not only the students of Pennsylvania, but the students all across the country because it's such important work. So as we transition to the panel today, just a couple quick asks of us, and as you're engaging, first and foremost, if you're going to tweet, please use the hashtag Race and Ed webinar. So hashtag Race and Ed webinar. If you'd like to ask questions, please add your questions, include your questions on the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to try our best to answer as many questions as we can over the course of this webinar. And if you're viewing us this event on Facebook Live, please make sure to share the event on your Facebook page. We would love to, to share the expertise of this amazing panel with as many of our friends as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to, again, take a moment to thank Travis, Anthony, and Gerard for their time here today. They can absolutely, as we look to answer questions, share examples of the amazing work, that they're engaged in across the country. But I didn't want to take the thunder or the time, to do so as an introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to now move right into our panelists, and I'm going to ask that that as each of our panelists introduce yourselves, consider answering the question at the same time. And the question would be, why do you think it's so important to diversify the teacher workforce? And specifically, share with us how teachers of color improve America's education system, how they enrich education, and just the difference those educators would make in our classrooms and beyond. So why don't we kick off with Dr. Bristol? Dr. Bristol, can you kick us off and share with us the importance of focusing on diversity in the teacher workforce?
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Rivera, for for the question and for the brief introduction. I just want to quickly pivot, and then I'll come back to the question, and I'll keep my time within the 4 minutes allotted. I think in keeping with the theme of yesterday's DNC convention around forming a more perfect union, I just want to acknowledge and thank Javed for, first privately, but also attending to the absence of gender diversity in the initial advertisements of this webinar, really being attentive to it. I think in all of our work, we are attempting to be more perfect. It is work, and so, and we can't think about diverse leaders without thinking of, we can't only have men thinking about diverse leaders without recognizing and acknowledging that women comprise the majority of the education workforce, and to have their voices absent does not get us at being more perfect. and it is work nonetheless. So Travis Bristol, I'm an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the Graduate School of Education. My work explores both teacher practice and teacher policy, and I study professional learning communities for teachers of color, national, state, and local policies that enable and constrain the working conditions for teachers of color. So to answer your question, Secretary Rivera, I think teachers of color matter for lots of reasons. I think that more recently, lots of the head-grabbing, the headline-grabbing studies around teachers of color have focused primarily on quantitative studies. That is to say, studies that draw direct causal connections between Black teachers teaching Black students. There's some research around Latinx, the added value of Latinx teachers for Latinx students. But I just want to go back a bit. Before desegregation, one of the things that Vanessa Siddle Walker has highlighted more recently in her book around Horace Tate, she talks about what Black teachers were able to do in segregated schools, that Black teachers were able to attend to the social and emotional experiences of their Black students and give them tools to navigate a society that was anti-Black, a society that through policies and practices exhibited anti-Black racism. And so when we think about teacher diversity, everyone runs to and finds ease in highlighting much of the quantitative research, but there's a whole body of research, beginning with Vanessa Siddle Walker, who talks about how Black teachers and Black educators have been able to hold and support Black students in hostile spaces. Of course, more recently, there is clear and convincing evidence. The science is clear that for Black students, having a Black teacher equates to increased learning, decreases in suspension, persistence through high school, considering transitions to college for Latinx students, having a Latinx teacher. There's some clear associations with taking more challenging courses. For example, so there is a convincing body of evidence that for Black and Latinx students, having a Black and Latinx teacher matters. There's also a growing body of evidence that white children are looking up and saying that their teachers are not reflecting the rich diversity of this country, and so they are talking and saying there's a preference for teachers of color. And so there is a clear body of evidence that teachers of color matter. That is the science. And because we live in a very diverse country, we owe it to all of America's children to have a teacher workforce that reflects the rich diversity of our country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bristol, for sharing that. Especially, highlighting the fact that having teachers of color, really highlights, a social emotional perspective. In focusing when you're focusing on the needs of Black students, brown students, students from diverse backgrounds, the fact that you're introducing more challenging coursework, and just having a classroom that's reflective of broader society, and it really makes a difference. So that preparedness for everyone, and just the work that you described and has and are championing in that space. Great opening. Thank you so much. As we transition to Dr. Graham, and examples with some of that work that you're engaging in around, at Winston-Salem University and your membership on the DRIVE task force. What do you think? How do we enrich this experience by improving, that workforce?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question, Secretary Rivera. And thank you to the Hunt Institute for inviting me to participate. I am Anthony Graham, Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Winston-Salem State University, former Dean of the College of Education at North Carolina A&T State University, where we did a number of initiatives to address this issue of diversifying the teacher workforce. And Dr. Bristol spoke to a lot of the quantitative and qualitative data that we've known anecdotally for years, for decades, that our teachers of color have a significant impact on all learners. So when you start looking at the impact that a black teacher, one black teacher would have on a black student in terms of ensuring that that individual is less likely to drop out, more students thinking about college aspirations, all students being impacted in terms of their reading and math scores in a positive way. The other piece that we don't tend to talk about, more of our teachers of color will call you on the carpet when it comes to racism and bias, not only in the curriculum, but also in terms of policy and what happens relative to personnel decisions and how we go about engaging the community. So a lot of the work that we're doing in North Carolina with this DRIVE task force, which was created by executive order by Governor Cooper, and DRIVE again stands for Developing a Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education. We're really taking a long, hard look at what we can do at the state level in partnership with various entities as it relates to creating an action plan, a measurable, actionable plan that we have to submit to the governor by January 1 of 2021. And what we're pushing for, what I'm really pushing for as the chair of this task force, is to move us away from thinking about programs and initiatives. In the immediacy, you have to do some programming and initiatives. But John Johnson said this a while ago, we're not going to program an initiative our way out of this. We have to really think about systemic change. So how are we now addressing policy issues? How are we looking at accountability models? How are we looking at budget appropriations? So those are the types of things that we're really trying to wrap our arms around in this 32-member task force. We have members who are state policymakers, K-12 representatives, so teachers, principals, superintendents. We have representatives from educator preparation programs, state early childhood representatives, parents of K-12 students, and we're working very closely with the governor's office. Ms. Latanya Patillo is the teacher advisor to Roy Cooper, our governor, and closely with the Hunt Institute. And we've been tasked with doing 5 things specifically, but I'm just going to highlight 3 for the moment. First, they've asked us to assess the state's progress toward increasing K-12 public school educator diversity. Secondly, we've been asked to look at short-term strategies, midterm strategies, and long-term strategies to help us begin to move the needle on increasing educator diversity. And then we've been asked to propose some metrics and standards to evaluate the success of the things that I've just mentioned. So for the first time in the 20 years that I've been in higher education in the state of North Carolina, looking at this statewide approach focused singularly on diversity is breathtaking, is refreshing, and I'm honored and humbled to lead the charge, if you will, as the chair of this task force. Now, before I be quiet, because I can talk all day, I have to speak very quickly about what we do at Winston-Salem State University. I've got to plug my university. By the way, we were Winston-Salem Teachers College back in 1925. So staying true to our roots as being a teachers institution. And we were the first Black institution in the nation to grant degrees for elementary grades. So I just want to make sure we're clear that WSSU has been leading the way for a long time. But we leverage our HBCU identity and our mission around social justice. And we integrate that unapologetically in the work that we do in terms of ensuring that we are infusing culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy into our curriculum, looking at anti-racist curricula, looking at assets-based orientation in terms of our thinking. And the thing that we do uniquely at WSSU, we focus intentionally on how you go about teaching Black boys and Black girls. We have standalone courses that focus on teaching Black boys and Black girls. We're centering the experiences, centering the voices of students of color in the work we do, and then we're engaging our students in school-based and community-based immersion experiences. So at WSSU, we're doing the thing. So I just want to make sure that I share with you all the great work that we're doing here.
Thank you so much. And absolutely plug away, share the great work you're doing. I think something that really resonated with me is how you kicked off. It's using data to quantify and qualify what we've known for years. And that's the difference that teachers of color can make for everyone that enters the classroom. And so thank you for your service and your engagement in that area. Next, I just want to remind the audience to use the Q&A feature, share, please ask any questions, share any comments that you may have on the link down below. And as we continue with this great conversation, I just want to pass it on to Mr. Robinson. So, as we're continuing and just kind of staying with this theme, where are teachers of color most needed, and what are the population of students that could, that must, most get exposed, to our teachers, to those teachers. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and just kind of share some of the great work that you're engaged in as well. I think you're still on mute, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Secretary. So let me thank President Jabez Siddiqui for extending to me an invitation, for Dr. Williams for the nice introduction, and for my colleagues to lay the groundwork. Let me dedicate my remarks today to three people. Number one is Septima Clark, who was a Tennessee-based educator who many people don't know about, but she said that chaos she likes, because from chaos comes creativity. And in the chaotic aspect of the African-American experience in the United States, from 1619 to the forward, we found ways to be creative in the midst of chaos. The other two people are Dr. Howard Fuller and Dr. Deborah Griff, former superintendent of schools in Milwaukee and Detroit, who from the 60s to this exact day have pushed the idea that we should diversify education. My take on this is actually personal. So in the late 1980s, I read a book called Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, written by Dr. Kunjufu. And he made the case that our school system is really set up to do exactly that, destroy Black boys. So in the time of the 80s, when I read it, I went, I'm not sure if it's true or not. I transferred to Howard University in 1987 in Washington, DC. And for a couple of years, I served as a tutor to students in the DC public school system. They had a partnership with a local church around the corner from my dorm, and I would go there to work with elementary students on reading and math. And it was conversations with them and their teachers where I realized what takes place in school is one thing, but our teachers are inheriting a lot of things that come from the community and from the home. So that was part one. Part two, I ended up volunteering for a couple of years with a program called Project Success. And it was created by a professor at that time at Morgan State University, who not only was trying to diversify the teaching force, but trying to support teachers, primarily African-American teachers at a school in Southeast DC, where there were a host of socioeconomic challenges. And the goal is, if we can bring in professionals, students like myself at Howard and others, if we can wrap our arms around the school, where the students would be the class of 2000, that if they maintained I think it was at that time a 2.5 GPA, they didn't get into too much trouble, this organization would pay for them to go to college. Well, the great thing is a number of them reached those criteria and had money to go to college. But it was 2 years with that program of talking to teachers and families and students and realizing that if you can see it, you can be it. Meaning that if you could see someone like yourself in a position of power, whether it's in government, whether it's in the military, whether it's in school, you could do the same thing. And it was as much an education for me to be around educators. At that time, I was at Howard University. I was a business major. My job was to work in corporate America as an executive. It was never to become a school teacher. But that was part two. Number three is for 2 years, I volunteered as a mentor to young African-American and Hispanic young men between the ages of 16 and 19, who were pretty much involved in the criminal justice system. And it was a very forward-thinking judge, who I still to this day have not met him or her, who said, I tell you what, you've got 1 foot on a banana peel and 1 on jail. You make the wrong move, you're gonna slip, and the slope is not gonna be great. And so they said, if you go through this HITCH program, which is an acronym for High Intensity Training Seminar, I'll take a look at your sentence. And for 2 years, we mentored these young men. They were from poverty, absolutely, possibly, well, mostly single parent homes, although they knew their dads. All the things we know were true. The one common denominator that every single one of them said was a challenge was literacy. the ability to be able to read, to understand complex texts, to understand and comprehend what they were reading, just across the board. And I was like, so this is an education issue. What we call a criminal justice problem in so many ways is an education issue. And so I decided to bypass going to corporate America. It would have made a ton more money than I did, like my friends who decided to go that route. I returned to Los Angeles, became a fifth grade school teacher because I wanted to be involved, because the 70% of the students who drop out by grade 10 did not become illiterate all of a sudden in September when they reached the 10th grade. Those were problems that happened in middle school, but guess what? Those were problems that started in elementary school. And so I saw how teachers transform lives and families. And so for me, I decided to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk by becoming a fifth grade school teacher. And that set up a path for me to be involved with it to what I'm doing today.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, as I shared, I wanted to participate in this, to listen and to learn and to engage. And a few things that are already standing out. This is going to be a fun conversation because we already focused on chaos. We already focused on challenging the system. We've already focused on, you know, addressing and creating more systemic opportunities to challenge and provide opportunities for students. So, you know, and so already within the few minutes, we're tackling some of the biggest issues, you know, that we could. And so to give you a little bit of time to breathe, why don't I go back, you know, and just ask, you know, Dr. Graham, and just to kick off and remind everyone, you know, please post your questions and anything else, but I'm going to continue for a little bit in our Q&A section. But, you know, I think just kind of kicking this off, Dr. Graham, what do you think? What's the connection between having a culturally relevant curriculum and then also having the students that represent, having the educators that represent the student body? So curriculum, educators, student body. You know, let's take a few minutes and just kind of tackle some of the thoughts in those areas.
Oh, it's critically important. And I define culturally relevant pedagogy using Gloria Ladson-Billings' definition, thinking about developing an individual's academic success. So those key academic skills, reading, writing, and so forth, building their cultural competence, their awareness of other cultural groups, and then that critical consciousness piece. And for me, the culturally relevant curriculum, having people being able to see themselves, being able to hear stories from people who look like them, going back to something Dr. Bristol said earlier about the DNC, the convention the last few days. As I've been watching it, you see diverse representation, and people are able to see and hear themselves. And going back to something that Dr. Robinson just said, if I see it, it now becomes explicit. It's no longer abstract. It's no longer conceptual. It now becomes concrete and explicit. So that means it can be done. So that's what this culturally relevant curriculum does for all of our students, not just our students of color, all of our students, but it really engages our students of color. And the piece that really sticks out for me, and the thing that we try to do in our educator preparation program at Winston-Salem State University, is that critical consciousness piece. Oftentimes you see people focusing on the academic skills, you see people trying to develop and build the cultural competence, but now is that missing element of how do you leverage what you've learned by infusing it into your community? How do you uplift those around you using the very talents and intelligence that you've been blessed with? That's the missing component in my mind. It's not just about me, it's about the collective us. And when we get our collectivist students, our students of color, engaged into this collective us and helping them understand the why of what they're learning, you're learning mathematics, not just to better yourself, but to improve your community. You're learning how to read and write, not just to better yourself, but to raise up your community. When we start making those dots connect, then we begin to see student interest increase. We see their motivational levels increase. We see their engagement go up. And all of these things are the recipe for good student achievement outcomes. as generally measured by these accountability models. We've got to stop focusing so much on the accountability model and start thinking more about how are we engaging people. I always tell candidates, you don't teach math, you don't teach writing, you don't teach, you're teaching people. You've got to see people and what they bring to the classroom, the assets that they bring to the classroom. And you don't see what they bring to the classroom as baggage. It's luggage where you can take them somewhere.
Luggage, not baggage. Love it. That's great. A couple great questions have come on, through the Q&A. So maybe I'll throw out a few out there to see, what your thoughts and reflections are in this area. And so we've spent a lot of time discussing educators, students, the learner, and the educator. But a great question came out on asking if there's any evidence that you have on promoting parental involvement as well. So what do you think is the importance of parental involvement, and any strategies that you might share, that could help parents engage? Mr. Robinson, you're the first to take yourself off mute. Maybe we'll jump to you, Joy.
Sure. So in a previous life, I was president of the Black Alliance for Educational Options. And we were the largest nonprofit organization working with African-American or Black parents on school options, both public and private. And so we received a grant, in fact, it was from the George Soros Foundation, to create something we call Parents with Power. And it was an institute that we had where we ended up educating over 2,000 parents in 9 cities. And the goal was to focus on parents who particularly had Black boys who were in special ed. Now we know that roughly 10% of the population K-12 public school sector find themselves in special ed. And even though African-American students make up approximately, depends on where you are, a certain percentage of the students overall, roughly again, 25%, there's a high percentage who are in special ed. Surely a number of those students should be in special ed because they have the characteristics, emotional or physical challenges that need so. But a lot of those boys were frankly put in special ed because of behavioral problems. It had nothing to do with academics. And so through our parental involvement weekend, we call it a Parent with Power seminar, we put them through a weekend where we actually did role playing on how, when you walk into a meeting to meet with the either the principal, the teacher, the special education personnel, all these adults who all of a sudden you feel intimidated. A lot of our parents had challenges with school, and now to walk in and have to go to adults who you believe are smarter than you, who have a different education and income level than you. So we walked through that. We also talked about what the research says about special education and not. Now, some of those boys stayed in special ed because it was necessary, but some of them were moved out because we actually empowered parents with the language, vocabulary, the language dexterity, but more importantly, the confidence to say, yeah, I think on this one you may be true, but the research for my kid says thus and so. So that was one way to do it. So the takeaway for me is parents, we can't always expect because they have a number of jobs, and we've seen, as you said, Secretary Rivera, with COVID, we really see the things we've known for a long time. Sometimes we have to meet parents where they are. So if that means we go to a parent's house or we use Zoom or something else, we've got to reach parents where they are without expecting them to come to us. And that's something I found to be pretty successful.
So kind of building mental muscle memory for when they show up to that meeting to better advocate for themselves and their parents and their children, and to meet parents where they are, for the system to do so. Great advice, feedback. And anyone else want to add anything on before we move on to another question? Dr. Grant, Anthony?
Yeah, I would say just very quickly, and what Dr. Robinson said is so true. And this is one of the things we try to teach in our Ed Prep program. And I put a lot of pressure on principals and teachers, meeting parents where they are. Not only, you're not obligated only to teach in your classroom, but also you're obligated to teach in your community. And we use a lot of exclusionary practices in our schools. The acronyms, the abbreviations, Title I, Title II, ADHD and all these other things. And people don't know what that stuff means. So it's our job to help individuals become code switchers, if you will. So while we're talking about stuff in this school, this is what it means in layman's terms, and this is how you can benefit from this knowledge that we're now sharing with you. Because in the final analysis, we want this thing to be a partnership. It's not just about me imposing my beliefs on you. This isn't what we call ethnocentric monoculturalism. That's not what we're after here. This is really about a partnership. And if we're not educating people beyond the classroom, then we're not doing our jobs as educators.
Maybe I'll just quickly add, there's this great podcast that the New York Times has recently produced called Nice White Parents. And you know, I think the big takeaway really is about how white parents have been the gatekeepers to progress. And so, and I would extend that to say that if white parents were to advocate for more teachers of color teaching their white children, then that would put a lot of pressure on local and state policymakers to take this issue seriously.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, absolutely. You know, and everything from the muscle memory to the meeting the parents where they are, to understanding the history of some of the social changes that have existed in this system, all plays a role in understanding how we can best engage parents and communities. Really appreciate it. The next question for me really hits home, and it's around policy changes and recommendations. And here in Pennsylvania, we're actually in the process now with the State Board of Ed of updating our teacher prep standards. We call it Chapter 49. But you know, some of the work that Donna Marie and my other colleagues are doing in Pennsylvania is to include cultural competency, trauma-informed instruction, to include a better understanding of, you know, of systemic, you know, and actual racism and how it plays a role historically into the education system. And we actually have a board who's been open and amenable to including that as teacher preparation considerations, you know, for the next generation of teachers. And it's an area that we're really proud of, you know, as a state to have championed. But I'd love, you know, again, first to answer Brian's question, but also to ask you, what other types of policy changes at the state level do you think would be most helpful in addressing the issues that we're discussing today and promoting solutions to diversifying the teacher pipeline?
Yeah, the one I'll throw out there that's just a pet peeve of mine, particularly with our educator preparation programs across the United States, is our overemphasis on Praxis Core as an entrance examination into our educator preparation programs. And I harp on this in every conversation because I believe with every fiber of my being, that test tells us absolutely nothing about your ability to be an effective teacher downrange. What that test does is it perpetuates this force out of teachers of color that we began to see when integration came about 1954, when we got rid of, and I say that intentionally, we got rid of 34,000 African-American teachers in the South because there was a fear from white people about Black teachers teaching their children. So we began to use these intelligence tests to weed out Black teachers. Well, we've never gotten away from that. And we continue to do it in 2020 using an instrument that tells us nothing about your teacher effectiveness. We talked earlier about social emotional learning and things of that nature. That's what we should be looking for. That's what we should be assessing and measuring, not some arbitrary assessment that tells me nothing about your ability to engage a person, to think about what people need in terms of their learning, growth, and development, to see people in an assets-based orientation as opposed to looking at them in a deficit perspective. These are the types of policies that we have to root out of the system so that we now can diversify the teacher workforce. That's what I'm after.
Great feedback. So you're saying one of the few, if not the only occupation where you actually have to take a test in order to get into that major before you actually finish the major is a barrier. Wonderful feedback. Mr. Robinson?
So I'll give you a policy to practice answer and then another one. So when I was Commissioner of Education in Florida, we were one of the recipients, as many states, of Race to the Top. And there was a portion of that money that we used to invest into a university in the southern part of Florida. The superintendent, the school board, and others said, you know what? We're taking a look at the last 5 years and we're looking 5 years into the future. And the population of our student body is diversifying in ways we have not seen. And so we partnered with the university and with the surrounding couple of districts and created a program to bring in African American and Hispanic men to become middle school teachers. And the goal was to make sure that we not only provided them financial support, but also made sure they went through the kind of programs a former dean at Winston-Salem was talking about in order to have them prepared. So it simply meant that we took money that was already there. We made a conscious effort to say we're going to identify men to teach in middle school. We looked at African American and Hispanic men in particular because that was a population that was growing, not because women were not important, but for this one we decided to make a decision to do so. Now I mention that today because for those of you who are listening or watching, you have CARES money in your state. Maybe one recommendation you can make to your governor or to the team responsible for this is to say, why don't we take a percentage of that and diversify the teaching pipeline initiative? The money's there for that. From a strictly policy side, and this was somewhat controversial, we took a look in Florida at where we wanted our students to be on examination standards and results for science. Florida's a big STEM state for a lot of reasons. And so I decided to raise the achievement score level for teachers who wanted to work in the STEM area. Well, when taking a look at the data, we know that was going to have an adverse impact on the number of African American teachers based upon the data that we had to look at. I reached out to the NAACP leadership, I reached out to others, and we had a conversation internally. We raised it, knowing that it would lead to fewer African American students. The interesting part is it didn't per se knock out non-African American students who were Black, those from Africa, those from the Caribbean, those from South America. That's a whole nother story that people like Dr. Agbu many years ago wrote about. And so there's some decisions that we're going to make that are going to have an adverse impact. And so if it meant I was down possibly 50, 60 teachers in order to have 1,000 more students prepared, it was tough, but it's one we had to make. And so as we're talking about diversifying, there are trade-offs of Faustian bargains that come along with policymaking, and that just happened to be one of them.
So I would say that we started this conversation about the importance of teachers of color, and so there are so many initiatives around recruiting teachers of color into the profession. I think it's also important to note that we've done actually, on average, we've solved the recruitment piece, that we see that many of these initiatives that people are launching or the organizations, philanthropic organizations are investing in, we're seeing large increases in people of color coming into the profession. The biggest issue is retention. Teachers of color are leaving, or they're leaving the profession and they're leaving their schools at higher rates. So I think we need much more attention to retention. So I was very happy to hear Secretary Rivera about your work with my friend Sharif Al-Mekki and the Center for Black Educator Development, because we're thinking about supporting and retention. And so I think that one policy piece then is, yes, we want to think about supporting teachers, but I haven't heard lots of conversations about also supporting principals, because teachers leave their students. Teachers, they do not leave their students, they leave their principals, because it's the working conditions. And who creates the working conditions in a school? The principal. And so if we're going to raise the capacity of how teachers are learning and supporting them around learning, we also have to think about and align how principals are learning and what principals need to learn in order to create the conditions so that all that money that we're spending, all the resources that we're spending to bring people in, that those teachers can stay because principals have created the conditions for them, teachers of color, to do so.
And just to follow up quickly to support what Dr. Bristol just said, I had my team in Florida take a look at why teachers were leaving, and they can volunteer to take the exit interview. The number one reason was principals, for all the reasons he mentioned. And so one place I would take a look, we're talking about HBCUs, and remember HBCUs as a number make up less than 10% of the institutions that are post-secondary in the United States, and yet they educate nearly a third of the Black teachers in the United States. And so Albany State University in Georgia received a $5 million grant, I believe, from the Wallace Foundation. Dr. Kathleen Amons is professor at Albany State. She can tell you more, but they invested the money exactly to get what Dr. Bristol is mentioning. We've got to look at principals and think. A lot of teachers become principals because they want more money, not per se because they want to leave the classroom. So there's also an aspect about teacher retention that can look at teacher leadership positions other than simply being a principal.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in really quickly because everything that you guys are talking about or that you're mentioning really speaks to the work that we've been doing. With our innovative teacher and principal residency program in Pennsylvania, right? We've collected a lot of data around, well, why are people leaving? What issues are institutions having with retention, with principals, with pre-service teachers and all of that? And we're finding over and over again that they don't have the tools, right? Faculty members don't necessarily have the tools to train principals, to train pre-service teachers as well. So what we've found significantly is that we have to start sometimes with the institutions of higher ed, because it begins to trickle down into the K through 12 space. So in Pennsylvania, we have 114 different ed preparation programs and over 504 school districts. And so we don't want to necessarily do the work in the school districts all the time. We want to focus on what can we do in the ed preparation space with our teacher and principal residencies programs, with our institutions in their preparation programs with students as well. And so what we continually find and what they're asking for is, how do we do this culturally responsive or culturally relevant and sustaining educational work? What does that look like, right? And they have no guidance, they have no training. And so that comes down to what Secretary Rivera talked about earlier, is that we have now began to think about institutionalizing a commitment to culturally relevant and sustaining education in Pennsylvania. And our State Board of Education have accepted that shift, right? So we're moving into a space where they're now beginning to acknowledge the importance of CRSE. And from there, we can begin to think about what are the competencies that align with what it means to be culturally responsive and sustaining in practice. And so a lot of that is institutions are reaching out to us at the department to say, and these are PhDs, right? These are people who they have been trained at the best institutions, and they'll say, we don't know, we have a need. We engage with our stakeholders, our principals, we engage with other, with our human capital team, what we call it, at the department, and folks are saying, tell us, show us, right? And so we've begun to do the work of saying, okay, we're going to work with institutions across the state. We're going to work with folks in the K through 12 space to develop these competencies that will guide what it means to be culturally responsive and sustaining. And I work closely with Sharif, he's a part of this. We funded him in this program as well, to say, how do we, at this particular stage, how do we begin to think about the impact on principals, right? Sharif was a former principal. How do we begin to think about faculty members? How do we begin to think about teachers? Because it's not just one. We talk a little bit about the ecosystem of diversity within public education, right here in PA, because we know that we could work with principals all we want, but if they're not, if they don't have the proper training, it's not going to impact the structure, their schools, their other leadership, their teachers as well. So we know we have to start at a space where institutionally we are committed, right? As a department, we're committed. We're institutions of higher education across the state are committed, and we're providing them with resources to say, not necessarily that we require that you're culturally relevant and sustaining in practice, but if you don't have the tools, we want to be able to share with you what that looks like and continually begin to engage with them along the way.
Anna Marie, thank you so much. Believe it or not, it's 2:53. I caught myself. My alarm went off on my phone, and this has been like, just sitting down with friends and having a cup of coffee over a great conversation. And so first and foremost, thank you so much. I wanted to learn and engage, and you absolutely did much more than that. What I want to ask, I guess, in closing, as we're wrapping up, if we could take a minute or two and just share with everyone online, share with us an example in bringing us home, how having a teacher of color played a role in your, or maybe even one of your students' lives, and what difference it made. So maybe the panelists, and I'll definitely invite Dawn Marie to participate, in that reflection as well. And so maybe we can bring us all home with a reflection, hopefully a feel-good reflection, but a reminder of why we do what we do and why we're here today. So maybe starting off with Dr. Bristol, since I didn't get to ask you an official question, if you don't mind, you'll kick us off, and then we'll work around the horn.
Yeah, I would say that after I left high school, all of my experience has been in predominantly white institutions. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley. My first 6 years, elementary school, K to 6, I went to what I would term now an Afrocentric school, where all of my teachers were Black. I remember in the second grade, learning about Crispus Attucks, Frederick Douglass, writing letters to Nelson Mandela. This was apartheid. That I have been able to successfully navigate white institutions that have been, on average, hostile to my existence as a Black person, as a Black man. It's been because I had Black teachers, Black administrators who provided a positive sense of self. So I learned curriculum, but I also knew that that my story didn't begin with slavery. I learned about the ancient queens and kings of Africa. And so I think that for me, that a part of doing this work is because I recognize that much of the professional success I have had has been because of the foundation laid at a critical point in my early development as a child, as a Black child in America, by learning at the feet of Black teachers and having a Black administrator. And so I think that is the importance and the role that Black teachers and a Black administrator has played in my own life.
Mr. Robinson?
My sixth grade teacher was Miss Clegg, and her husband was a basketball player at UCLA with John Wooden during the dynasty years. And she not only talked about the importance of education, but she introduced Latin to our school. Now, I think my family spoke Pig Latin, so I knew there was a type of Latin. But she introduced Latin, and I can't say I mastered it all, but her idea of talking about Latin and going to understand root words was important. She was my classroom teacher, but her husband was our banquet speaker. I played football, and he was our banquet speaker. And he was the first African-American man who I'd seen not only dressed in a professional way, but who talked about leadership. And it was like time had stopped. And I was listening to him talk, and I went home and told my mother, I heard a good speech. I'd like to be like him, with no idea of what that really meant. And so those two had, I think, a big impact on me in my early days. Now, I would say I didn't follow all of their advice. Now, think about the fact that I finished high school, I didn't have algebra. I finished high school without knowing how to read or write in a real way. So I went to community college for 3 years. And while I was there, I met Mr. Raymond Roney, and I met Elaine Moore, and I met a group of African Americans who wrapped their arms around me and said that your yesteryear doesn't have to be the pathway to your tomorrow. And so I went from finishing high school at one point with a 1.8 GPA to where I am today. But it was those teachers and those mentors. I think the greatest compliment to me is when I got married 14 years ago, one of the students, Black boy in my class, when I was a fifth grade teacher, his mother and a sister came to my wedding. And he and I are still in contact. He later went to Howard. He married a sister from Howard. They have 3 children. She's now a professor, getting ready to go to Georgetown. And so those are 3 experiences for me.
Dr. Graham?
2.7 GPA, 740 SAT score, math, verbal combined, single parent home, learning disability, a guidance counselor who said college is not for you. Mrs. Frances Blunt, my 11th grade English teacher, instilled in me a sense of confidence about who I was and reminded me on a daily basis, those data don't tell the story about who you are. You tell the story about who you are. And you can choose to be a critical thinker, a critical writer, an orator, but you cannot cut corners. You cannot make excuses. You must step up and be the man that God intended you to be. I sit here on the campus of Winston-Salem State University, 45 years of age, full professor, provost, and vice chancellor for academic affairs, when many people, myself included, never thought such an outcome was possible. But it's because of a Black teacher like Mrs. Blunt, who instilled that confidence in me, that helped me understand I can become what it is I desire if I'm willing to work for it. And I hope and I pray to God that on a daily basis, I'm doing the same type of work. I'm obligated to do this type of work on this campus, not only with the students that we serve, but also with our faculty and staff. That's my story.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Cole-Malott, why don't you bring us home with your great reflection?
Thank you so much. I just want to say that I've had predominantly Black teachers in my life. And one of the things that I appreciated about that is the expectations to which they held me as an individual. I always felt, you know, if I was sort of being mediocre, they would be the ones to say, you can do way better than that. There was always a challenge to rise to the occasion, to step up. I mean, that has been my experience in the, you know, when I was in the K through 12 space as a student, but also even in my PhD program, right? Having a Black faculty member was the biggest, made the biggest difference in my own experience at a predominantly white institution. So I don't think it's just about K through 12. I think it's throughout the entire structure of the system, ensuring that we diversify, because we need leaders who are going to train teachers who are going to have the impact in those K through 12 spaces. So I just want to say, you know, my PhD program, being pushed, being challenged, having to rise to a particular occasion, having to step up and push myself in the work that I've done, that's happened with a Black person, with a person of color. And so that's what I've appreciated the most about my relationship with Black faculty.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists. I mean, this has been, you know, an amazing experience and opportunity for me. And so, you know, again, I want to say thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the Hunt Institute for taking on this challenge and this opportunity to address, you know, race and education, and you know, and to remind everyone that, you know, please take advantage of the resources that the Hunt Institute has put out, you know, for all of us and all of you. To engage deeper around this work, and to remind you again that this is part of a series that I've had an opportunity to be a part of a few times now, and have always walked away feeling like I can be a better leader. The next conversation I know Hunt's is going to host is going to be September 3rd at 2 p.m. So please log on to the website, check it out, and you know, and register, you know, as it's you know, of interest to you. So please, you know, this was an opportunity for me to engage, but really have to highlight my friend, you know, Senegal and Jay and the rest of the team who have done an amazing job in supporting me as a leader. So the opportunity to support them, and you know, take the survey and recommend this opportunity, you know, to your colleagues if you feel it's worthwhile. But if nothing else, please continue to have thoughtful conversations around race, equity, and education. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of today. Thank you, guys.